Hello, my name is Hakon and welcome back to my channel where today I am going to say a few words about books again. Because even though I'm not considering myself as a booktuber, I certainly do make a few videos about books, literature, poetry, and indeed one could also, I presume, see my playing of the fighting fantasy game books as a kind of booktubing activity. But because I've been reading more and more the last few years, expanding my horizons when it comes to my taste in literature to include science fiction as a big new kid on the block in my bookshelf, there is a likelihood there will be more videos about books, which I've also threatened to do before as well, and I am going to hold good to my threats and make more videos about books. And a few months ago, I just did a little snippet video where I told you that I had bought these 4 volumes of books, Philip K.Dick's Collected Stories, volume 1 through 4, which just happened to be available when I looked for them. I have realized later that actually many of the great science fiction writers of what I consider the golden era of science fiction, which is the 50s and 60s, a little bit into the 70s, depends on the writer. Many of the big writers, the great writers, not necessarily the most popular writers, I don't know yet, of that era, their short stories have not been anthologized. And that, one of the reasons is the way that short stories were published in those days. They were generally not published as short story collections that would have been part of the portfolio of a writer's main publisher. Very often they were published in magazines, and there were lots of different science fiction magazines. I think there was quite a boom time for science fiction magazines and awards and prizes, all those things in the 50s and 60s, because there was a big paradigm shift in how science fiction was viewed and written. Now, just to generalize hugely, of course, there will be exceptions. Before the 50s, science fiction was pulp fiction. It was very simplistic plots. It was a bit of action, a bit of aliens coming down from other planets trying to invade Earth. It was those kinds of things. It was meant to be light, entertaining reading. Something happened, and a big part of it, I believe, is Second World War and the Cold War, and also obviously there were other movements in philosophy, and of course there's the science as well. Of course there's the space race, there is the space program. Suddenly humankind knew a lot more about actual space travel than they did just a decade earlier, and they knew more about planets, they knew more about the idea of, well, the possibility, I should say, of life on other planets, say for instance on Mars, which of course was one of the usual suspects when it came to where the aliens came from in the older stories. And so science fiction became more science fiction. And also philosophy fiction, because you could explore philosophical concepts, ideas about how to run a society, etc. What if you can do what if stories? What if this particular scientific discovery is taken to its extreme? What if this particular ideology becomes the one that rules everyone, taken to its extreme consequence? What will happen? Those kinds of ideas. And also there was a lot of exploration of ideas of time travel, and of course time travel paradoxes were known at the time, and people would toy with them, try to explore what would happen if, how do these paradoxes actually work, make stories around them. And right in the middle of this is Philip K.Dick. He does all of those things, and this early work, of course, the collected stories is chronological. His early stories, many of them are to do with time travel and time travel paradoxes. But there's always an underlying atmosphere that has to do with the Cold War. And because most of his stories take place in what seems to be exactly the same reality, the same imagined reality of a post-nuclear war, where the time travel often happens from after nuclear war eradicated basically all of mankind or forced people to live underground, very common in his stories, and then time travel to before that. And there's also some very short-term time travel stories, which quite an interesting concept that I haven't seen anyone else explore, is what happens if, say, you are meant to travel 100 years into the future and then back again, but then accidentally you travel 1 week into the future, and when you come back, which would be a week before, something happens. You explode on re-entry, as it were, and you arrive in the future 1 week after this. Your deaths are still a news story. How do you deal with that? What's the dynamic that goes around that? How do people react to that? That is also a story by Philip K.Dick, and actually quite an amazing one, I must say. So if you want us, the tagline now, the punchline of this video is that I recommend reading every single of the stories found in Philip K. Dick's collected stories. They're all worth reading. They do show some progress of change. It seems that in the early days, in the 50s, he did write a lot of short stories. He would write them back to back, and sometimes he would also let one story lead on to another. And you also get the sense, again, as I mentioned earlier, how it's all part of the same imagined reality of a future that is usually post-apocalyptic, which means you have concepts that are the same. There's the vid phone, there's other things like that. And also, which also I find very fascinating when I started reading science fiction, is that it's also very much of its time. So you can read science fiction from the 50s and 60s, and you have audio tape and data on tape. You have video phones, of course, so it's an evolution of the phone, but still usually it's a fixed device. It's fixed on the wall. You still have typewriters, actually. And of course you have data. If you have data, a storage medium is also tape. And another thing too, and this is in Philip K. Dick's stories, is so prevalent that I even mentioned it to my wife a few times. Usually within a few paragraphs on the first page, somebody lights up a cigarette. Doesn't matter where they are, whether it's on the spaceship or anywhere else, a cigarette is being lit up. So I'm thinking that Philip K. Dick, I don't know anything about him yet, any biographical information. I might look him up at some point, but I'm thinking that one of his routines for writing short stories was to sit down at his typewriter, light up a cigarette as he starts writing, and for some reason that cigarette always makes its way into the work. It's almost like a catalyst for the rest of the story. It is so prevalent that there was, I think, one story where there wasn't a single cigarette being smoked, and it felt so conspicuous that I had to make a big deal out of it when I was reading, and I mentioned it to my wife. Right, so this is an amazing collection of short stories. There's also artificial intelligence, there's robots, androids, and of course in the 50s and 60s, the idea of robots and where that technology was heading is very different to what we have today. If you read science fiction stories from the 60s, you very often have androids all over the place in the 90s, for instance, in the 1990s, very often, or even 80s, because it was quite common for science fiction writers to set their stories about 20 years in the future, sometimes 40 years in the future. So most of the timescales used in 50s and 60s science fiction are now in the past of our true reality. And of course, as we know, things haven't quite panned out the same way. But that's not the important thing about science fiction stories. It's not really meant, in most cases, at least that's not how I view it and how my take on it is, it's not meant to say anything about the future and how that it will be. It is very often a critique or an analysis of the present in the time that the science fiction story was written, and potentially also, if it is a very prescient story, something that can be a warning to the future, which it very often is as well. So Philip K. Dick, all of those things and more, absolutely highly recommended. These books, Philip K. Dick's Collected Stories, Volume 1 through 4. Now, for anyone living in the UK who wants to buy these on my recommendation, there will be an Amazon link in the description, which of course, if you use that, will be highly appreciated because it won't cost you anything more. But if you buy them from Amazon using that link, I will get a little bit of an Amazon credit, I presume. I don't think I've ever got one yet, so I don't know exactly how that works because I've been an affiliate of Amazon for so long, but I've hardly ever used the opportunity to use it. Now, I think I've sort of finished with what I wanted to say in this video, which is a little bit about Philip K. Dick's stories. Very good, well written stories, by the way. Very good narrative style, I think. Good balance between narration, dialogue. Everything feels quite good. One of my favorite writers, I would have to say, at the moment is Philip K. Dick. Another thing that I just remembered, because I did mention this in my introduction video to these 4 volumes as well, is that towards the last part of his career, Philip K. Dick did write more stories that have to do with religion. And for those of you who have read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, as opposed to just having seen Blade Runner, you know that a big part of the plot of the story in that book is to do with the religion of Mercerism. And there is actually a short story that is to do with that very specifically as well in the collection, which gives you a little bit more background about Mercerism. So those things are connected. It might actually be so if you read Philip K. Dick's work, I have a sense that there are things that tie them together, just like many of the short stories are tied together, and Mercerism is one of those things that tie it together a little bit. Right, so he did write more about religion towards the end of his life. I presume he had some kind of religious something to do with his own personal beliefs, I think, that he wanted to explore. So you do get stories about the nature of God, but often in a science fiction setting. So you have several stories where there are things that can happen in a science fiction story, like travel through time and space, that leads to a consequence of people gaining religious beliefs when they see this transition through time and space out of context without knowing about the technology behind it. In other words, any technology that is sufficiently advanced to you that you cannot understand will seem like a miracle. So there are some really interesting stories about how religions could have originated, and also there's a kind of a Jesus story as well, which is one of the best ones actually in the book, which also has to do with time travel. It's not about the historical Jesus, but it's not a character that showed up in sort of the 50s or 60s, I can't remember the exact time frame now, who was a time traveler from the future. I'm not going to give too much away now because it's quite a clever story, actually. But the idea is that this guy is traveled back in time because he has been tasked with changing something to prevent something from happening in the future. So I'm sure that even though I'm not giving much away, you can sort of think along the right lines now about what's going to happen. And that's another thing too, by the way. Short stories, very often good short stories have a kind of an open ending, a little bit of a twist, something at the end that changes your perspective a little bit or a lot of what exactly went before it. And case in point, of course, Stephen King, Roald Dahl, particularly, I think, are Roald Dahl probably best known as the master of that tale of the unexpected. There's also, of course, Jeffrey Archer, who's very good at creating these little twists as well that are quite satisfying. Philip K.Dick does have some twists or ways of trying to change your perspective right at the end of a story. For instance, in those stories that do have to do with aliens, one thing he has done in some of the stories is to first write everything from the perspective of, say, the human beings, and then right at the end you get the perspective of the aliens. So you're changing the viewpoint, and that gives you suddenly a full understanding of exactly what was going on. Things like that, and it does work really well. And but in Philip K. Dick, sometimes the twists are a little bit obvious, or rather, should I say, they're not very hard to deduce yourself. But it actually doesn't matter so much because it still feels satisfying, I think, as a reader, certainly for me, to read a story and feel that there might be a twist coming up or a viewpoint change, and it is exactly what you expected, because it still gives you the satisfaction of having picked up on the clues, and come to the right conclusion about what was going to happen. So I do apologize. I'm not going to be too concrete now about any of the stories. I have mentioned quite a few things now. I don't want to give away anything either, because it's a story collection that, or a set of story collections that one can sit down and read from cover to cover and enjoy every single story on its own merit. And sometimes it's nice not to know too much about what the stories are about. I'm just giving you some very broad strokes now. So Cold War, there's post-apocalyptic, there's androids, there's aliens, there's time travel, lots of time travel, there's time travel leading to religions, there's what is God, although less of that than I thought there would be, actually. And you can read them from a very secular standpoint as well. So I think that concludes this particular video. If I want to talk about other books now, I think I shall leave it for other ones, because in the genre now of Philip K. Dick, in that vein, you may have spotted, those of you who also have noticed my nice retidied bookshelf now, out of necessity, I can assure you, not because I wanted to necessarily, but I might have gone to Glasgow on a holiday recently, and I might have gone to charity shops, and in those charity shops there is a certain possibility that I may have found some books that might have tempted me into purchasing them, which has led to there suddenly being more books in my collection than there might be room in my bookshelf, which means that there might have been the need for a certain rearrangement of books in it. So that's why I've changed my shelf around, and it actually looks nicer now than it did before, I think. And also, of course, there's another shelf. There's more shelf space up that you can't see, and of course there's my DIY shelf on the wall over here you can't see, a little bit messier than this one, and I've moved some things back and forth between them as well. And some books, alas, have had to be put into boxes because I don't have much shelf space, and I have to keep the books that I don't usually need more than once every few years. They do end up living a little bit in the box sometimes. Anyway, I'm digressing. I know some of you like it, I know some of you don't. But if you watch this far in the video, I'm sure you're one of those who don't mind the digressions. When I'm making videos, it's like having a conversation with you, and I'm quite liking that. So, you may have spotted that right next to these collected stories of Philip K.Dick's, I also have the 3-volume Library of America 13 novel set of Philip K.Dick's as well. I will make a separate video about those one of these days. So it's a 3-volume set, Library of America, nice hardbound books, and 13 novels in 3 volumes. Yeah, I'll get back to those, but you would have spotted them, I'm sure. Right, so all that remains for me to say then is thank you very much for watching. If you are interested in buying the Philip K.Dick books or any other books and you want to support my channel, one of the ways you can do it then is actually to buy through my affiliate links on Amazon when they show up. Other ways to support my channel, like, subscribe, share. Also there is, you can buy my art prints on pixels.com. You can buy my music on Bandcamp. I don't stream anything. None of my music is on Spotify. It probably never will be on Spotify for so many reasons. Bandcamp is the way to go, I think. And there's Patreon, of course, if you want to support me there. Or you can buy me a coffee, etc. There are many options available if you appreciate my content and want to show it to me in a way that encourages me to make more and allows me to make more indeed as well. So thank you very much for that, and I'll see you in the next one. So goodbye for now.